So I'm in 3dcoat, and I'm going to do the same as I've done with 3ds Max. I'm going to retopologize this object. But there are some big advantages to using 3dcoat because it is dedicated to doing such things as retopology and UV layer and painting. So in order to start, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to points and faces, and this enables me to click on the screen and it creates these points. So what I want to do is click on the model and it will create points. And once it can detect that there are enough points to make a quad, it says, you click the right mouse button and it will create the quad. So I can go around this rock and create the quads. And as with doing this in Max, what I want to do is be sure that I have a fairly even triangle density. So the quads should be around about the same size. And the other thing I want to do is I want to make sure that the quads join up correctly so that I have a nice loop. And the idea for this is that this one section here will be one part of the UV unwrap, and then the top will be another part. So that's pretty good. So I'm going to come across here and I'm going to basically follow this contour around here. And that's a pretty good contour. If I want to move some vertices, I can select move mode. What Coat tries to do is try to detect whether you're trying to move a vertex or a quad or just an edge, and you control the sensitivity by making the brush bigger and smaller with the square keys, and it will try and work out what you're trying to do. If I hover over a corner, it's going to say, oh, you want a vertex, and if I hover over an edge, it'll say you want to move the edge, and then if I hover over the whole thing, it assumes that I want to move a polygon. So it's context sensitive, but it's also dynamic in that context sensitivity. You can change it up here if you specifically want to select an edge and you somehow can't. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. When using Coat, I highly recommend you build low density geometry first. In other words, you want to try and build your triangle density even, but you can use fairly large quads because you can subdivide, and what it will do is as it creates the extra geometry, it will also make sure that that geometry adheres to the surface. So if I subdivide this now by going into the subdivide option, you'll see that it's generated a whole lot more geometry and it's managed to make that geometry fit onto the surface. I'm just going to Control Z to undo that. And I'm going to finish off arranging where these quads are going to be. So I'll have a strip across there. I'll probably put one there, and one there, and one there. So you can see that it will fill in triangles for me as well. So I just have to hover in the gap and it's figured out that this needs to be a triangle. And when I right click, it becomes a triangle. Okay, I'm just going to turn the high poly off. Going to fill that last triangle in. Okay, that's the top. I'm going to have a look at the bottom now. Let's go round. It's a little bit bright. Actually, I'm going to turn the brightness down. Okay, let's join one of the sections up in the middle. And then add a bit more geometry. Same again on the other side. And pretty much done. Let's just turn the high poly off. If you want to force build a quad, you can go into quad mode and click on an edge, and then you can select which point. And I'm going to double click that point to make it a triangle. Okay, I've very quickly built that retopology model. And again, I'm going to subdivide this. And that's pretty good. That's quite a low poly model. I could subdivide it again and get even more detail, and you can see that as I get more detail it still conforms to the surface, and the other useful thing is that it will preserve that mesh flow. I think it's going to be super low poly, but it will also demonstrate the effectiveness of things like normal maps and baking. So now I'm ready to UV unwrap this. So I'm going to go down to the UV set of tools. I could go straight into the actual UV editor, but I tend to just work from the retop. And there's basically only need a couple of tools. There's a mark seams tool, there's an edge loop tool. So I know that I've got a pretty good edge loop running around here because that was the first piece of geometry I created. And oops, I'm in the wrong mode. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into mark seams, and you can see in this UV preview it dynamically shows the UV unwrap. In other words, what it does is as you change where the seams are on the model, it automatically unwraps it for you. So I can click here and it will start to separate this model out. So I want an edge loop that runs around here, and you can see that as I move this around it will show me where the edge loop is, and I basically want this loop. And you can see from the UV editor that it's now cut it into two separate pieces, and it's flattened it out. And the color of these pieces, so this color here is actually telling you whether it's stretched or compressed. And if I go into looking at this other section, you can see that because it's quite flat, it's a very neutral grey. And that's how you can tell whether things are stretched. And even though this is quite a neutral red, it's still very tame, it's very desaturated. In other words, there's no real stretching going on. So I'm quite happy with these UV unwraps. So I've literally done a couple of clicks and I now have a good UV unwrap for this rock. I need to pack it together into a single UV unwrap. So as you can see at the moment, we have a top piece and a bottom piece, and they are on completely separate layers. So I want to unify them, which means I want to put them into the same layer and I want to unwrap them. And now you can see both of these surfaces together. So this is the bottom, this is the top. You can see that some of it is red, and we can see dynamically looking at the model it puts checker patterns on there for us. And the rule is we want squares and we want them everywhere. So it's also color coded the section for me. So this blue section is a different texture island. Those are pretty good squares. This up top section is also pretty good. The green section, again, nice squares everywhere. We get a little bit of stretching around the edge. but not too much. It's all pretty good. So we have our UV unwrap all ready to go. And now what we want to do is we want to bake from the high poly to the low poly. So let's be clear what we're doing here. If I get rid of the low poly, this is the high poly object. And if I get rid of the high poly, you can see this is our low poly object. And what I want Coat to do is I want it to take the information from the high poly surface and bake it onto the low poly surface. What I've also done is I've actually colored the high poly model. So if I go into the sculpt room, this is the high poly model. And this is how it came in as is. But in the paint room, I've actually managed to paint this model, even though it's not unwrapped. It's a high poly model, but Coat will allow me to paint on it. So if I actually turn this on, you can see that I've gone away and I've just put some color information on the rock. If I go back into the retop room, you can see that if I hide the low poly, there's the color information. And the reason I've put color information on the high poly is to show that we can not just bake that normal information, we can also bake that color information. So in order to do this, there's a menu option. It's called Bake. So I'm going to click on Bake. And then it's already highlighted it for me because it knows what the popular options are. So this yellow option, Bake with a normal map and do it per pixel. And I'll click on that. It gives me some settings. And this is where 3ds Max has a cage. And what Coat does is it shows you a preview of the inside and outside geometry. So if we look at the show the outer shell, which is what it's doing at the moment, we want the outer shell to be completely outside the high poly object. And if I scrub this bar, you can see that what happens is it inflates it, and now I'm happy that the low poly is outside the high poly. If I preview the inner shell, I want this to be completely inside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this until it's completely inside. Okay, so now I have an inside and an outside guide. You can do some micro tweaks if different parts of the surface need some adjustments, but in general, you should just be happy to make the inside and the outside big enough so that they fit. I'm going to click OK, and it's going to go away and say, hey, what kind of engine are you building and what kind of maps do you want? So I've already set this up for Unreal Engine. So there is actually an option to say, build me the maps for Unreal Engine. I don't need any subdivision. These are the default settings are fine. You don't need to mess with them. And it basically says how big a texture do you want. So I'm doing a pretty big texture here. I'm going to make a 2K texture. And that's just because it's the default settings. And if I want to make it smaller, I'll actually just do it in Photoshop. Okay, so I'll go away, and it will go away and it will do the calculations. So it will produce some artwork, and then it tells me where it's put that information. Okay. So let's go into the paint room and actually have a look at what it's done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the high poly, and what we're looking at now is the low poly object. And that looks pretty close to the high poly. So let's just hide the low poly. So this is the high poly object. If I press W, you can see on the wireframe, this is a really dense mesh. It's so dense that when I zoom out, you can't even see any gaps. Okay. Let's hide this. Let's go into the paint objects. Let's turn on the low poly. Now you can see the wireframe for the low poly. So you can appreciate that this is so much quicker to render because there's a lot less geometry. Okay, so the next thing I want to demonstrate is that you can actually paint on the low poly as well. So if I go into the layers documents, you can see that I have a bunch of artwork in here, a bunch of different layers. And one of these is turned off. That's the curvature map that is generated by 3dcoat, and it's generated because it's going to use it for some special things. Generally, you don't want to be looking at your curvature map, and you certainly don't want to be editing it. It's generated a normal map and an ambient occlusion. It's also generated a layer called group, which is actually the original artwork, and it's also generated a painted layer because that was the name of my painted layer on my high poly. So if I turn this layer off, you can see that what we have is the original, what looks to be very close to the original high poly before I painted it. If I also turn off the ambient occlusion, you'll see it change very, very subtly. And then finally, if I turn off the normals map, you can see that this is just a low poly object. So this gives you some idea as to how much work these particular channels are doing. So let's put on the normal and the ambient occlusion again. Now, if I haven't painted the high poly, which is probably what the situation you're going to be in, I will want to make my own painted layer. And I can do that. I can add a new layer, and it's going to call this layer 6. I'm going to call this hand paint. And because I'm in the paint room, I have a bunch of fairly traditional paint tools. So I have my color swatch. I'm going to go for a mid-gray for the rock, and I have a paintbrush. So I'm going to make sure that my opacity is good, and I'm going to make sure that I'm painting on everything. And if I paint, I can paint anywhere. So I can paint right across the seam. What I want to show is what it actually looks like in the UV unwrap. So if I open up the texture editor, you can see here that I have a dynamic view of the actual texture. And I can zoom in and out and look around because it still is going to be an endless repeating texture. And if I go in and I paint on the model, you can see the texture sheet updates automatically. You can also see that I've got my ambient occlusion map. The normal map doesn't show up on this because it's not particularly useful. So I can go in and paint on this rock surface. It will paint across the boundary. So there's a texture seam here, and that would be quite difficult to paint. If I'm in paint mode, I can actually paint on here, live on this. And if I go off the edge, obviously what's going to happen is I'm going to end up with a seam. On the other hand, if I paint on the model, you can see that I can paint right across the seam. And so I can paint that seam out. So it will dynamically work across the seam, seamlessly, so to speak. Coat has also got some really powerful tools for working out whether to paint on the high parts or the low parts of your model, which it uses things like the curvature map for. It can also do things like stenciling. So for instance, I can use one of these stencils. Let's pick one. And I'm going to use the cube mapping. So I'm just going to move it around so that you can see how the stencil fits. And what this does is if I go in and paint with a brighter color, it will mask out so that you're only painting where the stencil is. So that's pretty cool. So you can get some nice effects. I can switch to different stencils and get different effects on it. You can load in your own stencils as well. And of course you can scale these stencils up. So you might want to have smaller or larger patterns. And again, that will work fine. The other quite interesting tool is that because 3dcoat is 3D aware of the surface, it will also let you paint on the high and low parts of the surface. So for instance, if I currently have this set to painting everywhere and always, but I can say to it, I want to paint more on the convex surface. So that means more on the parts that stick out. Let's just use quite a significant color here so that you can see. That's not very, and I need to turn the stencil off as well, that would help. So I'm going to paint on the edges, the highlights, the raised parts of this model. And as you can see, it only paints on those raised areas. I can also get it to paint on the concave areas, the parts that go in. Let's switch to a darker color. And you can see now I can paint basically inside the dark area, kind of a dry brush technique. And you have a whole list of ways in which you can manipulate the way it paints on different areas. Okay, so let's say that I've got this thing painted. And now I want to get my model and my materials out. So I'm going to go to File and I'm going to go Export Objects and Textures. And it brings up this dialog. So I want to export the geometry. It gives me an option to swap Y and Z axes because different software uses different axes. Again, we'll appreciate this if we think back to ZBrush Core, and when we exported the head out of ZBrush Core, it was tipped over on its side in Unreal. It also gives me an option to export the textures and the texture path. It gives me the extension that I want to work in, and I prefer to work in PNG for everything. And it gives me lots of options to export. So in PBR, there's lots of different ways in which we can define the surface. So we've only been working in color, but there's also roughness and metalness and emissive and ambient occlusion. So you would have to set this up, and I'm not going to do it right now because I've got it set up for another process. But that's the process, and then you just click the export button and it will save all of those, the geometry out to one place and the textures out to the next place. And that's pretty much how you use 3dcoat for the high poly to low poly workflow.